When I first discovered the truth about my husband's hidden family, it did not arrive like a lightning bolt or a dramatic scene from a film. It came quietly, almost unassumingly, in the form of small details that didn't sit right with me, fragments of a life I wasn't supposed to see, pieces of a puzzle I hadn't even realized existed until they began to assemble themselves before my eyes. And suddenly the picture was far more disturbing than I could ever have imagined, because this was not the kind of discovery one stumbles upon lightly. This was the kind that burns through your skin and settles in your bones, leaving you unable to breathe the same way, unable to think the same way, unable to even look at the man you once loved in the same way. And it began with something so simple I almost ignored it. A misplaced receipt tucked into the pocket of his jacket, the name of a store I had never been to, groceries I had never seen in our kitchen, and an address scribbled at the bottom. That wasn't ours, and though I wanted to dismiss it, though I told myself it was nothing, my instincts whispered louder, urging me to look closer, to peel back the layers he had carefully built around his life. And so I followed that thread, pulling at it until the whole fabric of our marriage began to unravel in my hands, every memory, every promise, every smile suddenly tainted with suspicion, and the more I dug, the more I saw. Late nights explained away by work that didn't exist, money that disappeared without explanation, phone calls taken in hushed tones, always stepping into another room, always turning his back to me as if I wouldn't notice the distance growing between us. And I, foolishly, chose trust over doubt until the evidence grew so heavy I could no longer deny its weight. Until one afternoon, when I followed him, my heart pounding against my ribs, my breath shallow, as if my body already knew what my mind refused to accept, and there it was, standing before me like a cruel mirror reflecting the truth I had tried so hard to avoid. Another house, another woman standing in the doorway with the same welcoming smile I once believed was mine alone, and children who ran to him with arms wide open, calling him the very name I thought belonged only to me. And in that moment the world around me cracked. It didn't shatter with noise, it cracked silently, painfully, like glass under too much pressure, and I felt myself falling through the pieces, unable to hold onto the life I thought was real, because nothing was real anymore, not the anniversaries, not the late-night confessions, not even the way he had once looked at me as though I were his everything. It was all a performance, a careful play acted across 2 stages, and I had been nothing more than one half of his divided world, a role he had written for me without my knowledge. And yet what hurt the most was not just his deception, but the realization of how blind I had been, how many times I had silenced my own suspicions, how many times I had chosen to believe in him instead of listening to the quiet voice inside me that begged me to see the truth. And standing there, watching him laugh with children who carried his face, who carried his name, I felt as though I were the stranger, the outsider, intruding on a life that was never meant to be mine. And the pain that surged through me in that instant was unlike anything I had ever experienced. It was not just heartbreak. It was a tearing apart of identity, a ripping away of trust, a betrayal so profound it left me hollow. And as I walked away from that scene, my legs trembling beneath me, my chest tight with the weight of secrets I had never agreed to carry, I realized that nothing about my marriage had been as it seemed, that the foundation I thought where the woman I had been ended and where this hollow, wounded version of me began. And in the depths of that devastation, I realized that betrayal is not just about the act itself, it is about the destruction it leaves behind, the way it erases your ability to believe, to trust, to even look at yourself in the mirror without wondering how you could have been so blind, how you could have let your guard down so completely, how you could have built your life around someone who was building his life around someone else. And the shame of that realization cut deeper than any blade ever could, because it was not just his lies that hurt me, it was the fact that I had given him the power to lie to me, that I had opened my heart so fully that he had been able to tear it apart without warning, without mercy. And in the quiet moments I replayed every detail, every story he had told, every late night he had excused, every sudden trip he had justified, searching for the cracks I had missed, the signs I had ignored. And the more I searched, the more I found, until the memories that had once been soft and comforting now turned sharp and cutting. And it was like carrying shards of glass inside me, each one pressing deeper with every breath. And I could not escape them because they were not outside of me, they were within me, stitched into the very fabric of my life. And I wanted to scream, to tear down the walls, to destroy everything that reminded me of him. But at the same time I felt paralyzed, weighed down by the enormity of it all, because when the person you love betrays you in such a way, it does not just break your heart, it breaks your sense of reality. It makes you question not only who they are but who you are, what you are worth, what your love means. And I felt myself drowning in those questions, pulled under by a current of despair that I could not fight. And yet there was still a part of me, a small, stubborn part, that refused to let go, that refused to accept that the lies and the double life he had been living began to reveal themselves not in a single confession, but in fragments, scattered pieces of truth that slipped through the cracks of his carefully constructed mask. And as I started to piece them together, I realized the man I had married was not the man I thought I knew. He was a stranger wearing the face of my husband, an actor performing a role so convincingly that I had believed every line of his script, every promise, every vow. And what made it unbearable was how ordinary those lies had seemed in the beginning, how seamlessly they blended into the fabric of our daily lives. So that when he said he was working late, I accepted it without question. When he said he was traveling for business, I packed his bag with love and wished him a safe journey. When he slipped away for phone calls, I told myself it was nothing more than stress or responsibility, never realizing that each of those excuses was a carefully placed stone in the wall he was building between us, a wall meant to hide an entirely separate existence that I was never meant to see. And the more I uncovered, the more I realized how meticulous he had been, how practiced in his deception, how easily he had slipped between two worlds, calling me his wife while calling another woman the same, sharing his life with me while dividing it with someone else. And it was not just the act of lying that broke me, it was the depth of the performance, the way he had managed to keep track of 2 anniversaries, 2 sets of children's birthdays, 2 homes that both carried the illusion of his love. And when I thought back to all the times I had felt him pulling away, all the times his eyes had seemed distant even as he smiled at me, I realized those were the moments his heart was elsewhere. And I hated myself for not seeing it, for believing so completely in the idea of us that I never questioned the possibility of him living another life. But his lies were not careless. Every loose end tied up so neatly that even when the truth began to surface, it felt like madness to doubt him. And that was his greatest weapon, the way he made me question myself, the way he made me feel guilty for suspecting, the way he twisted my love into a shield for his betrayal, convincing me that I was overthinking, that I was paranoid, that I was the problem when in reality the problem was him. And the more I reflected, the more I saw the manipulation that had been woven into our life together. Small gaslighting moments that had seemed insignificant then, but now screamed with clarity, the late-night arguments where he accused me of being insecure, the casual dismissals of my questions, the way he always seemed so calm, so composed, as though my doubts were laughable, and I, desperate to keep our love intact, always chose to believe him, always chose to silence the voice inside me that begged me to look deeper, because I wanted to believe that love could be enough. But love cannot stand against lies, it cannot survive a double life, and his double life was so elaborate that sometimes I wondered how he managed to keep it all straight, how he could walk into our home after spending the day in another, how he could kiss me goodnight after tucking his children into bed across town, how he could make love to me with the same hands that held another woman. And the thought of it sickened me, it hollowed me out, because it meant nothing was sacred, nothing was untouched, nothing was truly mine. And I thought of the gifts he had given me, the surprises that had once made me feel cherished, and I wondered how many of them were chosen in haste to balance his guilt, how many of them were mirrored with another woman receiving something just like it. And I thought of the times he seemed exhausted, the weekends he claimed to need rest, and I realized now it was not work that drained him, it was the weight of balancing 2 lives, of juggling 2 women, of lying so thorough. Another, how someone could smile at me while holding secrets so heavy they should have broken him, yet they did not, because he was comfortable in his lies, he thrived in them, and I was the fool who carried the burden of his truth without knowing it. And as I pieced together more evidence, as I uncovered bank statements that didn't match, phone records that led to places I had never been, whispers of his name in circles I didn't recognize, I realized his double life had roots deeper than I could have imagined, stretching back years. So many years that it made me wonder if I had ever truly known him at all, if the man I fell in love with had ever really existed, or if he had always been nothing more than a role he played for me while his true self was elsewhere. And the weight of that thought crushed me because it meant my memories were not mine alone. They were borrowed, shared, duplicated across 2 lives, and the intimacy I once cherished now felt like a performance he had rehearsed for another audience, and the betrayal of it all consumed me because it stripped away not only my trust in him, but my trust in myself, in my own judgment, in my own ability to see truth. And that is the cruelest part of being deceived, not just the lies you are told but the way those lies unravel your sense of reality until you no longer know what is true, what is false, what is love, what is manipulation. And as the layers of his double life revealed themselves, I felt myself losing grip on everything I thought I knew, spiraling into a darkness where every detail of my life had to be re-examined, every moment had to be questioned. And it was in that spiral that I realized his lies had done more than betray me. They had broken me, leaving behind a woman who could never again see the world through innocent eyes. The moment anger replaced heartbreak was not sudden like a strike of lightning, but gradual, rising from the ashes of despair, feeding on the endless nights of tears until there were none left to shed. And in their place came a fire that refused to be extinguished, a fire that burned hotter with every memory of his deceit, every echo of his false words, every detail of his double life that I had uncovered, because after the heartbreak had wrung me dry, after the grief had left me hollow, there was nothing left but rage, raw and unrelenting, and it began to change me from the inside out, reshaping the way I saw him, reshaping the way I saw myself, and where once I had begged for answers, begged for explanations, begged for reasons that could never be good enough, I now found myself unwilling to hear another word from his lying mouth, unwilling to accept another excuse, unwilling to carry the weight of his sins on my shoulders any longer, because anger gave me clarity where sorrow had blurred my vision, and in that clarity I could see him not as the man I loved, but as the man who had destroyed me, the man who had taken years of my life and poisoned them with lies, the man who had divided himself between 2 families while pretending to be whole with me. And it was in that realization that my heartbreak transformed into something sharper, something more dangerous, and I began to replay every moment not with pain, but with fury. Every late night became an insult, every fabricated story a weapon he had used against me, every smile he offered now a reminder of how deeply he had betrayed me, and the fury that welled inside me gave me a strength I had not felt in months, a strength that pushed me out of bed when the grief had once kept me prisoner, a strength that steadied my hands when they had once trembled with devastation, and I began to understand that my anger was not my enemy, it was my salvation. It was the only thing that kept me from drowning in the sorrow he had His arrogance, the way he had believed he could juggle 2 families without consequence, the way he had underestimated me, the way he had counted on my silence, and that only fed the flames, because I realized he had never expected me to fight back. He had thought I would simply break, fade into despair, and disappear from his path, but he did not know the woman I was becoming. He did not know that every moment of heartbreak was forging me into something stronger, something unrecognizable, something far more dangerous than the quiet, trusting wife he had once deceived, and the rage coursed through me like a second heartbeat, steady and unrelenting, and with it came visions of justice, visions of retribution, visions of him brought low by the very lies he had built his world upon. And I began to plan not with desperation, but with intent, my mind sharpening in ways it never had when sorrow clouded it. Because anger is a teacher. It strips away illusions and forces you to see the truth in stark clarity, and the truth was that he did not deserve mercy, he did not deserve forgiveness, he did not deserve the life he had built on my pain, and though the heartbreak had once begged me to understand him, the anger now demanded I destroy him, demanded I make him face the weight of what he had done, demanded I turn his carefully constructed double life into rubble, and each day I felt the shift more deeply. The moment of heartbreak receding further into memory while the fire of fury consumed everything in its path, and I could feel it in the way I carried myself, in the way I spoke his name no longer with trembling but with venom, in the way I no longer avoided the truth, but embraced it as fuel. And I knew that this transformation was irreversible, that the woman who had once been blinded by love could never return, that she had been burned away in the flames of betrayal, leaving behind only the embers of wrath, glowing hotter with each passing hour, waiting for the right moment. The decision to seek justice and regain my power did not arrive as a single moment of dramatic revelation. It was a slow, deliberate turning of a key inside a lock I had never known existed, a steady, stubborn resolve that grew each time I reminded myself I was more than the sum of his betrayals, and it began as a quiet promise whispered to my own reflection in the mirror. I will not be erased. I will not be silenced. I will take back what he stole, words that at first felt fragile but that hardened with each passing day into a strategy, a plan, a cause, because grief had taught me how deeply I could feel and anger had taught me how fiercely I could act, and together they became the engine that drove me from victimhood into agency. And so I started by gathering evidence, not with a detective's flourish, but with the careful patience of a woman who had learned to watch and wait, collecting receipts, screenshots, bank statements, whispered names that led to addresses, messages hidden in the seams of his life, each paper and pixel a small, but undeniable truth that could no longer be denied or dismissed, and the act of collecting felt like reclaiming pieces of myself that he had scattered across his two worlds, because every document I taped into my notebook was a piece of armor, every recorded call a shield against the gaslighting that had kept me small for so long. And as the pile grew heavier, I began to see a shape to my plan, a path forward that did not require his permission or his confession, only my persistence and my willingness to face whatever came next, and that willingness surprised me with its ferocity, because the woman, who had once folded into silence was now organizing her life with the precision of someone who understood that justice is rarely served on a silver platter. It is carved out with careful, sometimes messy work, and I was ready to do the work, whatever the cost, because the alternative was to let him continue unchallenged, to allow his lies, me, for the very idea of truth itself, which deserved to be defended even when the defender was tired, even when the nights were long and the memories heavy. I reached out to people I had once been too proud to call upon, and in doing so I discovered an unexpected army, a sister who believed me without question, a neighbor who had suspected but had been too afraid to act, a lawyer recommended by a friend who had seen similar cruelty and who spoke in plain, fierce terms about rights and restitution, and each person who stepped into the circle I was forming added a different kind of strength, practical advice, legal knowledge, emotional scaffolding. And together we turned my solitary fury into a coordinated force, because revenge, I realized, without structure, without law, without support, is merely spectacle. With structure it becomes accountability, and accountability is the closest thing to true power I could imagine. A means to ensure that the man who had divided his life would not walk away unscathed. I learned to speak in facts rather than accusations, to present evidence not emotion, to let the weight of what I had discovered do the talking while I stood steady, and in courtrooms and meetings and quiet conversations with officials I felt a strange calm, as if the oxygen in the room had shifted to favor truth. And while the system was slow and sometimes exasperating, every box ticked, every affidavit filed felt like a step toward reconstitution, toward building a life that would not be defined by his deceit, but by the way I chose to respond to it. And in those procedural moments I found a new identity, not the betrayed wife, but the woman who would not let an injustice be swallowed by the convenience of silence. Financial tactics became a battleground too, because power without resources is fragile, and he had used money as both promise and weapon. So I audited our accounts, separated what was rightfully mine, enlisted a financial advisor to untangle the thread. Mortgage, the next bill, the next plan can be borne on your own terms, and that independence was as vital as any court ruling, because revenge that leaves you bankrupt or broken is not victory. It is another kind of loss. I wanted to win in a way that restored rather than depleted me, and so I measured my steps with both legal acumen and long-term sustainability in mind. Public exposure was a weapon I considered with caution. There is power in naming, in refusing to let a lie hide behind polite smiles, but there is also danger in spectacle, in letting anger become a show that distracts from accountability. And so I chose my moments, releasing information only when it served a purpose. To protect my children, to prevent further manipulation, to ensure that those who enabled him could not feign ignorance, and every carefully judged revelation sent ripples through the circles he frequented, forcing alliances to shift and secrets to be re-evaluated, and watching those ripples reminded me that sometimes justice is less about dramatic confrontations than about small, precise exposures that leave no room for plausible deniability. Alongside the legal and financial work, I rebuilt my emotional life, because pursuing justice on paper, without attending to the wounds in my heart, would have been hollow. I found a therapist who specialized in trauma and betrayal, joined a support group of women who had faced similar duplicities. And in the shared stories and steady listening, I discovered the language to name my pain without letting it define me. And that language became another form of power, the ability to speak my truth without stumbling, to set boundaries without apology, to reclaim rituals of self-care that had once seemed indulgent, but now felt essential, morning runs that cleared my head, meals that I cooked for myself not as consolation, but as sustenance, small celebrations when a legal motion passed or a bank account was secured, each tiny victory a brick in the new structure I was building, and in those bricks I placed my intentions, safety, dignity, and a fierce refusal to be erased. The road was not linear. There were setbacks that tested my resolve, delays in hearings, legal expenses that stretched thin our new budget, moments when guilt threatened to creep in, wondering if revenge was making me cruel, whether my pursuit of justice was the same as the harm he had caused. But each time doubt surfaced, I revisited the evidence, the children's faces, the silence I had been forced into, and I found my answer. Justice was not vengeance for vengeance's sake, it was a reclamation. A way to name what had been stolen and to demand its return in the form of accountability and changed circumstances. And with that clarity I pressed on, strategizing with my lawyer, preparing statements that were measured and clear, gathering witnesses who could corroborate the pattern of his deception, ensuring every claim I made could stand up under scrutiny, because I did not want my truth to be dismissed by sloppy rhetoric or emotional theatrics. I wanted it to be undeniable. And as the legal machines turned slowly, as negotiations and hearings took their deliberate course, I watched my life reorient itself around new priorities: protection for my children, financial security, and the slow cultivation of a self that could one day love again without fear. And with each passing month, the man who had once held dominion over my days found his control diminishing, not because I had sought to humiliate him, but because I had learned to assert my rights, to speak my terms, to walk away from what no longer served my dignity. And in that walking away there was a kind of triumph that felt quieter and truer than any spectacle could have afforded me, because to regain power was not merely to cause him pain, but to restore my own life to a place where pain was no longer the definition, where I could stand in sunlight without the shadow of his deceit trailing me. The transformation from victim to survivor seeking revenge did not happen overnight. It was the slow forging of a new identity out of the broken pieces of the old one, a reshaping that began when I stopped asking why and started asking how I would move forward, how I would reclaim my dignity, how I would ensure that his betrayal did not become the defining chapter of my life. And in that shift I discovered that survival was not about simply enduring, it was about reclaiming power, about turning pain into weaponry, about standing tall even when the ground beneath me felt unstable. And I began to see myself not as the woman who had been lied to, but as the woman who had seen through the lies, who had uncovered the truth, who had taken the shattered remains of trust and forged them into armor. And that armor did not make me invulnerable, but it made me unafraid. And with each step I took I felt the distance growing between who I had been and who I was becoming, the tears of the betrayed wife drying into the steel resolve of a survivor who would not be forgotten, who would not be erased, who would not be reduced to silence or shame. And the rage that once consumed me began to evolve into something sharper, something colder, a focus that allowed me to plan with precision, to move with intent, to calculate the steps that would not only protect me but expose him. Because revenge was no longer just an idea whispered in the dark, it was a mission that grew clearer with every sunrise. And as I embraced that mission I began to notice the way people looked at me differently, some with pity, others with fear, some with admiration they dared not voice, because they could sense the shift in me, the way I carried myself not as a victim, but as someone who had walked through fire and refused to be burned. And that aura became another form of power, a silent declaration that I was not to be underestimated again, not by him, not by anyone. The survivor in me began to see opportunity. Not diminished me, it had sharpened me, honed me into someone more aware, more awake, more unwilling to accept less than she deserved. And as the days passed and I grew stronger in this new identity, I began to imagine futures that had nothing to do with him, futures where his name was not a wound but a scar, a reminder of what I had endured and overcome. And those futures felt expansive, filled with possibilities I had once forgotten I was allowed to dream, futures where my children would see me not as broken, but as resilient, where they would learn that betrayal can destroy your illusions, but it does not have to destroy your spirit, and that lesson felt like the truest revenge of all, the passing down of strength instead of sorrow, resilience instead of resignation. Yet even as I moved forward, the survivor in me never forgot the victim I once was, and I carried her with me, not as a weakness, but as a testament, a reminder of how far I had come, how much I had endured, and how much I refused to endure again. And in that remembrance I found clarity, that revenge was not only for him, it was for me, for the woman who once cried in silence, for the woman who once begged for answers that never came, for the woman who once thought she was powerless, and to honor her I had to keep going, had to keep fighting, had to ensure that the story did not end with betrayal, but with reclamation, and so I stood taller, spoke louder, acted bolder, and in doing so I transformed the narrative itself, no longer the wife left behind but the woman who walked away stronger, no longer the deceived partner, but the one who unveiled the deception, no longer the victim of lies, but the wielder of truth. And that transformation was the ultimate revenge, because it denied him the satisfaction of my ruin, it denied him the legacy of my silence, it denied him the control he had once exercised over my heart, my mind, my future. And as I stepped fully into the survivor I had become, I felt the echoes